Behind Charlton Heston's towering performance as Michelangelo lies a bizarre world of steel nose rods, chocolate pudding dripping from ceilings, feuding superstars who avoided each other for decades, and a film that accidentally predicted art restoration techniques 20 years before they happened. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about the Agony and the Ecstasy. Fact 1. Steel rod nose Job. When Charlton Heston accepted the role of Michelangelo in the Agony and the Ecstasy, he knew he had to look the part of one of history's most famous artists. But what many people don't realize is just how far the dedicated actor went to achieve physical accuracy for his portrayal. Heston actually inserted a steel rod inside his nose to make it resemble Michelangelo's famously broken nose, which the real artist had suffered from a punch to the face during a fight with a fellow artist in his youth. This wasn't just a simple makeup trick or prosthetic piece that could be applied and removed each day. Heston committed to having this metal rod placed inside his actual nose for the duration of filming, demonstrating the extreme lengths he would go to for authenticity in his performances. The broken nose was a distinctive feature of the historical Michelangelo, and Heston felt it was essential to capture this detail to properly embody the Renaissance master. What makes this story even more interesting is the contrast with his co-star's approach to historical accuracy. While Heston was literally altering his face with metal implants, Rex Harrison took the completely opposite stance when it came to his own character's appearance. The real Pope Julius II was well known for having a full beard during most of his reign, a distinctive feature that was documented in portraits and historical accounts of the time. However, Harrison flat-out refused to grow a beard for the role, despite this being a much simpler and less invasive way to achieve historical accuracy compared to what Heston was doing. Harrison's clean-shaven appearance throughout the entire movie was purely due to his personal preference, creating an amusing situation where one actor was inserting steel rods into his nose while the other wouldn't even grow facial hair for authenticity. Fact 2. Chocolate pudding paint torture. One of the most memorable and uncomfortable-looking scenes in the Agony and the Ecstasy shows Michelangelo lying on his back on scaffolding high above the Sistine Chapel floor, with wet plaster constantly dripping down into his mouth and eyes as he paints the famous ceiling. What viewers didn't know while watching Charlton Heston endure this apparent torture was that the filmmakers had found a surprisingly tasty solution to make the scenes more bearable for the actor. The movie required numerous scenes showing Michelangelo working in extremely difficult conditions, with plaster and paint dripping from the ceiling onto his face as he worked. To create this effect realistically, the production team needed a substance that would look convincing on camera but wouldn't be harmful to Heston during the many takes required for these sequences. Real plaster would have been dangerous and potentially toxic if consumed repeatedly, and other artificial alternatives might have looked fake or caused health problems. The creative solution that the film's crew came up with was to use chocolate pudding instead of actual wet plaster for all the dripping scenes. This meant that every time viewers saw Michelangelo suffering as thick, gooey liquid dripped into his mouth during those grueling painting sessions, Heston was actually getting a mouthful of dessert rather than construction material. The chocolate pudding had the right consistency and color to look like wet plaster on camera, and it was completely safe for the actor to ingest repeatedly during multiple takes. This behind-the-scenes detail adds an amusing twist to what appear to be some of the most physically demanding and unpleasant scenes in the entire movie. While the real Michelangelo certainly did endure genuine hardship and physical discomfort during the 4 years he spent painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Hollywood version of his suffering was considerably more palatable than it appeared to audiences in 1965. Fact 3. Epic feud that lasted decades. The tension between Rex Harrison and Charlton Heston during the filming of The Agony and the Ecstasy was so intense that it created one of Hollywood's longest-lasting feuds, spanning well over a decade and affecting their professional relationship for years to come. While the two actors were supposed to be portraying the complex relationship between Pope Julius II and Michelangelo, their real-life animosity toward each other was apparently just as dramatic as anything happening on screen. During the production in 1964, Harrison and Heston simply could not get along, despite both being seasoned professionals who had worked with difficult co-stars before. The exact reasons for their mutual dislike have never been fully explained publicly, but their inability to tolerate each other was obvious to everyone on set. Interestingly, this personal conflict may have actually helped their performances, since they were playing two strong-willed characters who constantly clashed throughout the story. What makes this feud particularly remarkable is how long it lasted and how completely Harrison committed to avoiding his former co-star. 12 years after the Agony and the Ecstasy wrapped filming, both actors found themselves cast in the 1977 film Crossed Swords, also known as The Prince and the Pauper. This swashbuckling adventure movie featured an ensemble cast, which meant Harrison and Heston would inevitably be working on the same production again. However, Harrison's dislike of Heston had not diminished at all during the intervening years. Throughout the entire production of Crossed Swords, Harrison made a deliberate effort to completely avoid Heston on set. He would arrange his schedule, plan his movements around the studio, and coordinate with the crew to ensure that he had as little contact as possible with his former co-star. This level of sustained professional avoidance between two major Hollywood actors working on the same film was highly unusual and demonstrated just how deep their mutual antipathy ran. Fact 4. Burt Lancaster was originally cast. The Agony and the Ecstasy that audiences saw in 1965 was actually a very different film from what was originally planned, and it starred a completely different actor in the lead role of Michelangelo. 20th Century Fox had initially purchased the film rights to Irving Stone's novel back when the book was first published, and the studio was eager to turn it into a major motion picture as quickly as possible to capitalize on the novel's popularity. The original plan was for the movie to begin production in 1961, with Burt Lancaster cast as the famous Renaissance artist. Lancaster was a major star at the time, known for his athletic build and intense performances in films like From Here to Eternity and Elmer Gantry. He seemed like a natural choice to play the passionate and physically demanding role of Michelangelo, and the studio was confident that his name would help draw audiences to what they hoped would be a prestigious historical epic. However, 20th Century Fox ran into serious financial trouble that completely derailed their production schedule. The studio was spending enormous amounts of money on another historical epic called Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. The costs for that film spiraled completely out of control, with budget overruns that were so massive they nearly bankrupted the entire studio. Fox was hemorrhaging money so badly that they had to put almost all of their other major projects on hold while they tried to recover from the financial disaster. This crisis meant that the Agony and the Ecstasy had to be postponed indefinitely while the studio figured out how to stay in business. By the time Fox had stabilized their finances enough to resume production 3 years later, Burt Lancaster was no longer available for the project. The delay ultimately led to Charlton Heston being cast in the role instead, completely changing how audiences would experience this story of artistic genius and papal power. Fact 5. Michelangelo's Moses-inspired Moses casting. One of the most unusual casting stories in Hollywood history involves Charlton Heston, and a strange connection between two completely different movies that created an almost mystical artistic circle. Heston's physical resemblance to Michelangelo's famous sculpture of Moses was so striking that it actually earned him one of his most iconic roles, years before he would ever portray the artist who created that very sculpture. Michelangelo's statue of Moses, carved between 1513 and 1515, depicts the biblical prophet as a powerful, bearded figure with an intense expression and muscular build. The sculpture was originally intended to be part of Pope Julius II's tomb and remains one of the most recognizable works of Renaissance art. When director Cecil B. DeMille was casting for his epic biblical film The Ten Commandments in 1956, he was looking for an actor who could embody the physical presence and commanding authority that the role of Moses required. DeMille and his casting team noticed that Charlton Heston bore a remarkable physical resemblance to Michelangelo's marble Moses, particularly in his facial structure, beard, and overall imposing presence. This similarity was so strong that it became a major factor in Heston's casting for the role. The actor's natural features seemed to match the Renaissance master's vision of what the biblical Moses should look like, making him an almost obvious choice for the part. Nearly a decade later, when Heston was cast as Michelangelo himself in The Agony and the Ecstasy, this created an extraordinary artistic connection that spans centuries. The same actor who had been chosen to play Moses because he looked like Michelangelo's sculpture was now portraying the artist who had created that very sculpture. This meant that Heston was essentially playing both the subject and the creator of one of history's most famous works of art, creating a unique situation where life, art, and cinema intersected in an almost surreal way. Fact 6. 12-minute documentary opening confusion. The Agony and the Ecstasy has one of the most unusual opening sequences in movie history, beginning with a complete 12-minute documentary about Michelangelo's life and works before the actual story even starts. This lengthy prologue was narrated by Marvin Miller, who was well known for his distinctive voice work in television and radio, and it served as an educational introduction to the Renaissance master's artistic achievements for audiences who might not be familiar with his work. The documentary segment was titled "The Artist Who Did Not Want to Paint" and was produced by writer Vincenzo Labella specifically for the film. It featured footage of Michelangelo's most famous sculptures and artworks, providing historical context and background information that the filmmakers felt was necessary for viewers to fully appreciate the story that would follow. This approach was quite unusual for a Hollywood feature film, as most movies would incorporate this type of background information into the narrative itself, rather than presenting it as a separate documentary. What makes this opening even more interesting is that it underwent changes between its initial release and later versions. The original documentary prologue included a specific reference that mentioned Michelangelo's famous Pietà sculpture was currently on display at the 1964 New York World's Fair. This detail was included to give American audiences a contemporary reference point and encourage them to see the actual artwork if they had the opportunity. However, this dating reference created problems for later releases of the film. After the World's Fair ended and the Pietà was returned to its permanent location in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the reference became outdated and potentially confusing for new audiences. Film distributors decided to edit out this specific mention in subsequent releases and home video versions to prevent the documentary from seeming tied to a particular time period, making the prologue more timeless for future viewers. Fact 7. Based on shortest book chapter. Irving Stone's novel The Agony and the Ecstasy was a massive biographical work that chronicled Michelangelo's entire life from his early years as a young apprentice in Florence all the way through his death at age 88 in Rome. The book covered decades of the artist's career, including his famous sculptures like David and the Pietà, his architectural work on St. Peter's Basilica, his poetry, and his complex relationships with various patrons and rivals throughout the Renaissance period. Given the scope and length of Stone's comprehensive biography, Hollywood filmmakers had an enormous amount of material to choose from when adapting the novel for the screen. They could have focused on Michelangelo's youth and training, his creation of the David sculpture, his later architectural projects, or any number of dramatic episodes from his long and eventful life. The book provided multiple storylines and character arcs that could have supported a feature-length film. Instead, the screenwriters made the unusual decision to base the entire movie on just one chapter from the novel, specifically the section dealing with Michelangelo's commission to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. This chapter covered the period from 1508 to 1512, when Pope Julius II forced the reluctant sculptor to take on what would become his most famous painting project. What makes this choice even more remarkable is that this particular chapter was quite possibly the shortest chapter in the entire book. The filmmakers essentially took what amounted to a relatively brief section of Stone's comprehensive biography and expanded it into a full 2.5-hour epic film. This meant that while the movie covered only about 4 years of Michelangelo's 88-year life, it provided an incredibly detailed and focused look at this specific period. The decision to concentrate on such a small portion of the source material allowed the film to explore the relationship between Michelangelo and Pope Julius in great depth, but it also meant that audiences missed out on most of the artist's fascinating life story. Fact 8. Fake Chapel predicted real restoration. The movie studio's recreation of the Sistine Chapel for The Agony and the Ecstasy accidentally became a crystal ball that predicted the future of one of the world's most famous artworks. Since the Vatican would not allow filming inside the actual Sistine Chapel, the production team at Cinecittà Studios in Rome had to build a full-scale replica that would be convincing enough for audiences while also functional enough for the complex filming requirements of the movie. Creating this replica presented the studio technicians with a major challenge in reproducing Michelangelo's famous ceiling frescoes. They needed a method that would look authentic on camera, but could also be constructed in sections that could be gradually removed during filming to show the painting's progress throughout the story. After experimenting with various techniques, they decided to photograph the original ceiling artwork and blow up these photographs to cover the replica ceiling in their studio chapel. However, the ceiling frescoes in the real Sistine Chapel in 1964 looked very different from what Michelangelo had originally painted. After more than 400 years, the artwork had accumulated layers of dirt, soot from candles, and grime from countless visitors and religious ceremonies. The colors had become muted and darkened, and there were visible cracks and deterioration throughout the painted surfaces that made the original brilliant colors almost impossible to see. When the movie's set decorators worked with the enlarged photographs of the ceiling, they made artistic decisions to brighten the colors and digitally fill in the cracks to make the artwork look more vibrant and appealing for the film. They wanted audiences to see the frescoes as Michelangelo might have intended them to appear when they were first completed, rather than how they looked after centuries of aging and damage. 20 years later, the Vatican began a comprehensive restoration of the actual Sistine Chapel ceiling that lasted from 1980 to 1994. When this restoration was completed, the real chapel looked remarkably similar to how the movie set had depicted it back in 1965, with bright, vivid colors and smooth surfaces that matched the film's enhanced version. Fact 9. Heston denied. Gay Michelangelo. Theory. 30 years after playing Michelangelo in the Agony and the Ecstasy, Charlton Heston became involved in a public dispute about the Renaissance artist's personal life that showed just how seriously the actor took his research and portrayal of historical figures. The controversy began when filmmakers working on a documentary called The Celluloid Closet approached Heston about using clips from his Michelangelo film in their project, which examined how Hollywood had portrayed gay and lesbian characters throughout cinema history. The Celluloid Closet documentary was exploring the theory that Michelangelo was homosexual, a topic that has been debated by historians and art scholars for centuries. Some researchers have pointed to certain aspects of the artist's personal life, his poetry, and his close relationships with male companions as possible evidence of his sexual orientation. The documentary makers wanted to include scenes from the Agony and the Ecstasy as part of their examination of how Hollywood films had either hidden or hinted at the sexuality of historical figures. However, Heston firmly refused to give permission for his film clips to be used in the documentary. In his 1995 autobiography titled In the Arena, Heston explained his reasoning behind this decision. He stated that he had conducted extensive research while preparing for the role of Michelangelo and had become convinced that the historical evidence did not support the theory that the artist was gay. Heston told the documentary filmmakers that based on his thorough investigation of the available historical records, he could assure them that Michelangelo was not homosexual. The actor's refusal to allow the use of his film clips effectively blocked the Celluloid Closet from including the Agony and the Ecstasy in their documentary. This incident demonstrated Heston's strong commitment to what he believed was historical accuracy and his willingness to take a public stand on controversial topics related to the characters he had portrayed, even decades after the films were made. Fact 10. Anachronistic weapons galore. The Agony and the Ecstasy include several battle scenes that showcase Pope Julius II's military campaigns to unite the Papal States, but these sequences contain some glaring historical inaccuracies that would make any weapons expert cringe. The film shows soldiers using rifles and cannons that were far more advanced than anything that existed during the early 1500s, when the actual events of the story took place. The movie depicts battles with firearms that look remarkably similar to weapons from much later periods in history, particularly rifles that resemble designs from the 1700s or even 1800s. During the real Michelangelo's time, gunpowder weapons were still in their very early stages of development, and most soldiers would have been fighting with swords, crossbows, pikes, and other traditional medieval weapons. The few primitive firearms that did exist in the early 1600s were extremely basic compared to what appears on screen. Even more problematic are the cannons shown in the battle scenes, which display a level of sophistication and design that wouldn't be developed for many decades after the historical period the movie is supposed to represent. The artillery pieces in the film look like they could have been used during the Napoleonic Wars, rather than during Pope Julius's military campaigns. Real cannons from the early 1500s were much more primitive, often unreliable, and quite different in appearance from the sleek, efficient-looking weapons shown in the movie. This type of anachronistic mistake was fairly common in historical films made during the 1960s, when movie makers often prioritized dramatic visual impact over strict historical accuracy. The film's battle scenes needed to look exciting and impressive for audiences, so the production team likely chose weapons that would photograph well and create the desired cinematic effect, even if they weren't historically appropriate for the time period. These weapon choices created battles that looked more like conflicts from the American Civil War era then Renaissance Italy. Fact 11. Laurence Olivier was first choice. When 20th Century Fox began casting the Agony and the Ecstasy, their first choice to play the powerful and temperamental Pope Julius II was Sir Laurence Olivier, one of the most respected actors of his generation. Olivier was already considered a master of classical roles, and had proven his ability to portray complex historical figures with authority and depth. The role of the warrior pope seemed like a perfect fit for an actor who had successfully brought characters like Hamlet, Henry V, and Richard III to life on both stage and screen. However, Olivier was unavailable when the film's production schedule was finalized, forcing the studio to look for an alternative. This led to the casting of Rex Harrison, who brought a completely different energy and style to the role. While Harrison was certainly a talented and accomplished actor, fresh off his Academy Award-winning performance as Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady, his approach to playing Pope Julius created an unexpectedly humorous situation for audiences and critics. Harrison's distinctly English accent and mannerisms were so pronounced that he essentially played the Renaissance Pope as if he were a refined British gentleman who had somehow found himself running the Catholic Church in 16th century Italy. Critics and audiences couldn't help but notice that Harrison's portrayal made Pope Julius sound more like he belonged in a London drawing room than in the Vatican. Some reviewers jokingly referred to Harrison's performance as creating the most English pope ever to reside over Rome. This casting choice highlighted one of the ongoing challenges in historical filmmaking, where studios must balance the need for marquee names that will draw audiences with the requirement for actors who can convincingly portray characters from different cultures and time periods. While Harrison delivered a strong performance that helped carry the film, his unmistakably British persona created an amusing disconnect between the character he was supposed to be playing and the way he actually appeared on screen. Fact 12. $8 million epic box office disaster. The Agony and the Ecstasy represents one of Hollywood's most puzzling box office mysteries, as it had all the ingredients for success but still managed to lose a staggering $8 million worldwide. 20th Century Fox had invested enormous amounts of money in the production, creating elaborate sets, filming in authentic Italian locations, and hiring two major stars in Charlton Heston and Rex Harrison to anchor what they hoped would be a prestigious historical epic that could compete with other successful films of the era. Charlton Heston was particularly confident about the film's prospects based on the audience reactions during test screenings. In his later writings, he described The Agony and The Ecstasy as having the best preview responses of any film he had ever been involved with during his entire career. The test audiences were apparently enthusiastic and engaged, giving the studio every reason to believe they had a hit on their hands. Heston recalled that the preview screenings featured standing ovations and loud applause, creating an atmosphere of excitement that suggested the film would be both a critical and commercial success. However, when the movie was released to general audiences, it performed far below expectations at the box office. The film only earned around $4 million during its initial theatrical run in the United States and managed to bring in approximately $8 million in worldwide rentals. By September of 1970, Fox estimated that the film had lost over $5 million, though other reports suggested the losses were closer to $8 million when all production and marketing costs were calculated. This dramatic difference between the enthusiastic preview responses and the disappointing box office performance left everyone involved scratching their heads. The film received generally positive reviews from critics and was even nominated for several Academy Awards, but audiences simply didn't turn out to see it in the numbers that the studio had anticipated based on those early test screenings. Fact 13. Real Carrara marble quarries used. One of the most authentic aspects of The Agony and the Ecstasy involved filming location choices that created a direct connection between the movie and the historical Michelangelo himself. When the story called for scenes showing Michelangelo fleeing to the mountains after destroying his initial work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the filmmakers made the decision to shoot these sequences at the actual Carrara marble quarries in the Massa Carrara region of Tuscany, Italy. These quarries were not just chosen for their dramatic visual appeal, though the white marble cliffs and mountainous terrain certainly provided a stunning backdrop for the film. The Carrara quarries were the exact same location where the real Michelangelo had traveled centuries earlier to personally select marble for his most famous sculptures. The historical Michelangelo made multiple trips to these quarries throughout his career, carefully choosing the perfect blocks of white marble that would eventually become masterpieces like David and the Pietà. The decision to film at Carrara created an almost mystical connection between the movie production and the Renaissance master's actual life and work. When Charlton Heston walked through these quarries as Michelangelo, he was literally standing in the same locations where the real artist had stood, examining marble and making the artistic decisions that would shape some of the world's most celebrated sculptures. The quarries look much the same today as they did in Michelangelo's time, with the same dramatic white marble faces carved into the mountainsides. This attention to authentic locations extended the film's commitment to historical accuracy beyond just costumes and sets. The Carrara quarries are located relatively close to Michelangelo's hometown, making them a natural choice for scenes showing the artist returning to familiar territory when he needed to escape the pressures of his work in Rome. The filmmakers could have easily used any mountainous location for these scenes, but their choice to use the actual historical site added a layer of authenticity that connected the movie directly to Michelangelo's real experiences. Fact 14. Heston wouldn't dine with his character. During a later interview about his long and varied career, Charlton Heston was asked an interesting hypothetical question about which of all the characters he had portrayed over the years he would most like to invite to his home for dinner. Given that Heston had played everyone from Moses to Ben-Hur to El Cid, this question offered him the chance to choose from some of history's most fascinating and powerful figures, each representing different aspects of leadership, faith, and human achievement. Without hesitation, Heston chose Michelangelo as the character he would most want to have as a dinner guest. This choice revealed how deeply the role had affected him and how much he had come to appreciate the Renaissance master's artistic genius and complex personality during his preparation for the Agony and the Ecstasy. Heston clearly felt a strong connection to the artist and was genuinely curious about what it would be like to have a personal conversation with someone of Michelangelo's creative caliber. However, Heston's answer came with an amusing and self-aware caveat that showed just how well he understood the character he had portrayed. He acknowledged that while he would love to invite Michelangelo to dinner, he was fairly certain that the artist would not actually show up to the meal. This admission was based on Heston's portrayal of Michelangelo in the film as someone who was notoriously unreliable when it came to social obligations and prone to disappearing when he didn't want to deal with people or situations. Throughout the Agony and the Ecstasy, Michelangelo is shown as a man who frequently avoided appointments, ignored summons from powerful people, and generally did whatever he wanted regardless of social expectations or consequences. Heston's comment about his dinner invitation demonstrated that he had fully internalized this aspect of the character's personality and understood that even in a hypothetical situation, Michelangelo would probably find some excuse to avoid showing up for dinner, no matter how honored he might be by the invitation. Fact 15. Michelangelo never painted lying down. One of the most memorable and dramatic images from the Agony and the Ecstasy shows Charlton Heston as Michelangelo lying flat on his back on scaffolding, straining to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling while paint and plaster drip into his eyes and mouth. This scene has become iconic in how many people imagine the creation of one of the world's most famous artworks. But it turns out that this dramatic portrayal is completely historically inaccurate. The real Michelangelo did not paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling while lying on his back, despite what the movie shows and what many people continue to believe. Historical evidence, including Michelangelo's own writings and sketches, reveals that he actually painted the ceiling while standing upright on his scaffolding system. The artist designed a complex wooden platform that allowed him to work from a standing position, with his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle to reach the ceiling above him. This method was still extremely physically demanding and caused Michelangelo considerable pain and discomfort during the 4 years it took to complete the project. In fact, Michelangelo himself wrote a poem about the physical agony of painting the ceiling, describing how his neck ached from constantly looking upward and how paint dripped onto his face. However, he was standing while enduring these hardships, not lying down as the movie depicts. The filmmakers likely chose to show Michelangelo lying on his back because it created a more visually dramatic and emotionally powerful image for audiences. The idea of an artist lying flat while creating a masterpiece above him seems more tortuous and sacrificial than simply standing with his head tilted back. This artistic license made for compelling cinema, but it also created a widespread misconception about how one of history's greatest artworks was actually created. The real process was difficult enough without needing to add the extra drama of painting while lying down, But Hollywood's version has become so iconic that many people still believe this is how Michelangelo worked.